Listen, I really need Leslie Vernon as a character to be kind of as popular as, say, a Freddy Krueger or a Jason. And the reason I need that is because I really want a Leslie Vernon t-shirt that's super cheap. So if you guys could all watch this video, decide that the film seems like your kind of bag, and then in your millions, go out and generate huge amounts of interests for this and spotlight it into a franchise, that'd be sweet. It's literally just so I can get a cheap t-shirt. Hope that's cool. Slashers! Icons of the horror landscape of the 70s, 80s, and a little bit of the 90s, the only thing higher than these fellas' body counts is my love for their genre. We all love a good slasher movie. Myself more than most, I might have did a whole video essay marathon on them a couple of years back. But let's be honest, they are nowhere near as popular these days, tragic as that may be. Besides the franchise faces we know and love, looking at you, Ghostface, Michael Myers and Chucky, the slasher genre has kind of become something of a pastiche effort. There's a thirsty audience there for it for sure, and that's why we get a lot of indie filmmakers trying to capture that je ne sais quoi of the widely recognised neon and blood-spattered vibes of the 80s. But generally speaking, they're not the landmark staples of cinema they used to be. While I've got no doubt we'll get a new Nightmare on Elm Street at some point, fingers bloody crossed on that one, it's been long enough, and a Friday the 13th movie will probably be on the way once all the legal battle dust settles down properly. There's already a spin-off series on the way after all. The cinema screen though didn't used to be home to just the big boys. There was tons of slashers that carved out an audience back in their heyday. But I'm not certain we're going to get a high production value, decently modest budget legacy sequel to Happy Birthday to Me or April Fool's Day anytime soon. You know what I mean? April Fool's 2008 direct-to-video remake doesn't count before anyone gets smart with me in the comments. If anything, kind of proves what I'm saying in that slashers are not the dominant genre of horror they once were, even with the slight resurgence they've had as of late with films like Happy Death Day, X and Pearl, the Terrifier series. There is some good stuff coming out, but these types of movies used to be more common in cinemas than popcorn and superhero movies are now. So nowadays, when you make a slasher, it's kind of not enough to just make a slasher. When there's an entire decade that sort of did every variant possible of the basic slasher formula, unless you're purposefully doing a throwback, you gotta do something to make it interesting. Because if audiences wanted to watch Friday the 13th, they got 12 of them already there to choose from. Granted, there's actually very few of them are any good, but they are there. So how do you do something in a genre that the world kind of pretty much nailed down to a core formula without departing so much from that formula as to not be in the genre anymore? People have found ways to get around this problem. You've got slasher in a time loop, slasher in reverse, slasher that's meta, slasher that's really a tragic character drama, slasher across decades. Despite the misconception that slashers are one note, there's still plenty of creative entries in the genre that do pop up from time to time and play around with a massive range of interesting variables while still sticking within the limitations of the genre. Namely, there's gotta be a creepo, they gotta have something sharp, and there's gotta be some kills. And if you ever wanted proof that the slasher genre can do something really out of left field, totally interesting and totally new and still firmly be a hand-on-heart slasher flick that absolutely loves and admires the films that paved the way before it, then look no further than Leslie Vernon, the man behind the mask. A slasher film whose twist on the formula is a really unique hook. What if this slasher movie is a documentary? Part meta deconstruction of the genre, part love letter, part commentary on journalistic integrity, and part compelling character study. There really is quite a lot of interesting stuff going on in this one. Leslie Vernon is a mockumentary following a journalist and her crew trying to make a big splash with something hard-hitting. A documentary focusing on a dude with big aspirations to be a slasher villain. Think Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, but with a far more tongue-in-cheek tone. Disguising exposition through the clever device of the journalists setting the scene for their doc, we're introduced to this world as being one where the slashers of old were real, elusive serial killers with notorious body counts, getting nods into all the big names like Crystal Lake, Jason, Freddy in Elm Street, and Michael in Haddonfield. As our lead presenter Taylor monologues her intro, we even get a nice little cameo from Mr. Voorhees himself when Kane Hodder can be seen playing a local resident, avoiding answering Taylor's questions. With the stage thoroughly set, our crew then go to meet the subject of the doc himself, Leslie Vernon, a bizarrely friendly and effortlessly charismatic practicing killer who claims to be the young boy from a local urban legend. The story goes that he was enslaved by his parents, who forced him to till the fields with nothing but a sickle. Eventually, he snapped, hanging his mother Molly from a tree in the family orchard, and when news of this violent act spread, the townsfolk threw him over a waterfall to die. But he survived, and with the perfect setup to become a slasher villain. His backstory even spreading to have all these deliciously sinister extra details, like the now abandoned Vernon farmhouse being haunted, and on the night of the harvest moon, the fields supposedly churn red with blood. With his backstory firmly in place and serial killer training and prep that the crew are documenting coming into its final act, Leslie plans to make his first big splash on the slasher scene. It's becoming something of a town tradition for the teens of Glen Echo to spend an entire night in the old Vernon farmhouse as a fun place to drink and do dares, and Leslie plans for a new group of teens taking part in that tradition to become his first big massacre. One element has to go absolutely perfect though, or the whole thing is meaningless. Leslie must get his survivor girl right. Behind the Mask is very passionately appreciative of the tropes of the genre it's marging. It intelligently dissects them, but never in the kind of smarter-than-thou, ironic, above-it-all, mocking way a lot of metafiction has gravitated towards these days. You get the sense when Behind the Mask engages with slasher conventions, it's as much because it has something to say about them as it is to advance the plot and narrative. The survivor girl, previously mentioned, is this film's take on the trope of the final girl that occurs so often in these kinds of movies. That is to say, the virginal sole survivor who fights off the monstrous man in the final act of the movie. There are many reasons why this trope exists. A lot of people at the time wrote it off as a shallow way to allow audiences to engage in the sadism of a powerful man tormenting a fragile woman for long amounts of screen time. And since then, there's been a lot of kind of cultural re-examination of the trope that has given a lot more thought and, I'd argue, deserved credit. Carol J. Clover's Men, Women and Chainsaws being a book that kind of led the charge on those discussions, and one I referenced a significant amount during Wholesome Halloween 2 slasher season. And Behind the Mask, through truly excellent writing, has lots to contribute to the conversation too, but in a way that smartly doesn't just feel like a lecture, and instead more so feels like natural things these characters might think and say that enriches our understanding of them and the world they occupy. A fantastic example is through different characters' interviews, like Leslie discussing the need for the survivor girl and for the conventions and for the massacre to take place. You see, Leslie, and people like him, see their work as almost an art piece. While it may seem disgusting to some, it's a necessary purging of fear. In the context of this fictional reality, people like Leslie must exist, as must their last survivor to teach the world that the darkness can be defeated. He has to become evil so that people can believe good can triumph over it. His work is a story, and what an interesting look into this character's psyche that gives him a self-justifying angle that somewhat weirdly sort of makes sense in a way that obviously in real life would not fly, but rationalizes a terrible person's motives in a way that an audience can see a depth in his perception. And obviously the meta-commentary here is pretty compelling too, because with slasher films, people like me see them almost as an art piece, if you will. While they may seem disgusting to some, they represent a purging of fear. In the context of cinema, slashers must exist, as must the final girl trope that defeats them. They must be these films full of evil so that people can believe, you get what I'm doing, I don't need to repeat the whole thing, you see what I'm saying here. It's both an interesting character motivation as well as a clear commentary on the uses and gratifications of the slasher movie within culture. It becomes this story about the power of stories and our conversations around them. If, like me, you're a horror fan in any capacity, you'll have no doubt at some point had a friend, family, or even a stranger give you the whole, I don't know how anyone can enjoy that stuff, it's sick, it's twisted. And Taylor, as Leslie's interviewer, sort of takes on this role, constantly asking Leslie, Why does this need to happen? Why does there need to be a final kill? Why does Leslie need to die by her hand? Why all the conventions and the performativity? And fantastically, the answer Leslie gives when you break down its core is because stories matter. That's why. I'm sorry, but that's brilliant. This sentiment, a sentiment that runs throughout the whole film, is for me the biggest strength of it. That elevates it beyond a fun mockumentary with great performances and some meta gags into something genuinely engaging, thought-provoking and special. Obviously, terrible justification for a real-life murderer, which this film kind of pretends to document, but in the context of fiction, what a powerful sentiment to any sort of write-off criticism of the horror genre, and one I wholly agree with, and that resonates with me deep in my soul. The kind of idea Leslie is essentially espousing here is basically the very reason that I love horror so much. It's the Wes Craven quote, "Horror films don't create fear, they release it." It's the Neil Gaiman line of "Fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten." Behind the Mask is a film that occasionally pokes fun at the tropes and conventions of the slasher genre, but it also wants you to know that it loves these films and feels they are worthy of a greater recognition as a whole than being written off as trashy sadism. With this dialogue, Behind the Mask elevates the idea of the slasher to the status of the myth, of the parable, cultural artifacts that teach us something about ourselves and the world. And for what's essentially a daft mockumentary about a serial killer, I personally find that really profound. This isn't the only thematic thread of the movie too. Obviously, the subject matter of the documentary the characters are making sees the cast and crew become willing bystanders, if not wholly complicit in the violent and disturbing actions of a, yes, charismatic, but also awful man. Throughout the movie, there's an interesting relationship forms between the crew and the killer, especially with Leslie and Taylor, in ways that only slowly at first, but ramp over time, definitely create an emotional investment in what unfolds in front of the camera that challenges their biases and their journalistic integrity. There are multiple occasions where the film seems to ask of the crew, should they maybe do something about this? And they have to navigate the ethical dilemma of finding that balance between being objective and unbiased documentarians and just doing the right thing. And it makes for a really compelling narrative hook that gives the film stakes even outside of its promised massacre. As Leslie and Taylor become closer, you can kind of begin to see her and the crew getting a bit too over-familiar with this guy, and getting swept up in the moment of it all, and maybe even enjoying it a bit too much, only for some sudden realization to come at a particularly problematic occurrence that brings the reality of what they're filming crashing back down onto them. And this is all sold with really great performances, especially from Nathan Basil, who plays the titular Vernon. The way he bounces off of Taylor and the crew with a swift naturalism gives him a really charming human quality. You could totally believe spending enough time with this person, you could be swept up by his charms. It's not like a theatrically seductive type of charm like, say, a Dracula kind of character. He's just got this affable, effortlessly likeable quality to him. It just all feels so grounded. And he takes on this persona of what us Geordies would describe as a canny fella. But equally, he still has that dangerous quality to him too. Every now and then when you see the sinister quality underlying, when he'll lose his patience and his manner can turn gives a sort of double entendre meaning to the title Behind the Mask. Like the unhinged Leslie Vernon out to kill is the real person, and the friendly, playful dude is the mask. I will say its themes around journalistic responsibility aren't explored quite as smoothly as its genre discussions. While the latter it weaves seamlessly in and out of the plot, often in really hilarious and engaging ways, there is, depending on who you are, some stretching of your suspension of disbelief required to buy into just how much the documentary crew are willing to go along with, despite warnings. But personally, that didn't bother me too much, because I feel like since the point is that they're willing to go too far for this project, I can get on board with it feeling like an illogical decision at times. I'm personally of the belief that a film should always make more emotional sense than logical sense, if you get me. And it's clear to me that these characters' actions, well, not something I or even most people would do in their situation, are plausibly possible and help pull at this thematic thread more. And what's also great about the film is that even if you don't want to engage with any of this stuff, the movie is still just wildly entertaining on a purely surface level. It's well paced, it's well acted, it's so funny and quotable, especially if you like slasher movies. I'm a big fan of Leslie's explanation of how slowly walking horror villains always seem to catch up with the heroes. It's got a real respect for the genre titles that came before it. There's lots of fun references that aren't just naming things you remember, but make sense as the setup for jokes and interesting conversation topics. On top of the Kane Hodder cameo, Zelda Rubinstein actually makes her last on-screen appearance in this film. And Mr. Kruger, Robert Englund, gets a full role in the movie. And he's really great in it. The whole thing plays really cleverly with the format of not just the documentary, but also the slasher film. I don't want to spoil the third act for anyone who hasn't seen it, but I will say it's really cool how it uses elements established in the documentary portion of the movie to pay off and explain elements that occur in the slasher portion. And also, one thing I couldn't find a better place to naturally insert praise for, but there's absolutely no way I'm finishing this video without giving it its flowers. Leslie Vernon looks great. Like, the actual slasher killer presentation and costume. It's so rad. Do you know how hard it is to actually make an iconic looking character who immediately sticks out in your memory? Do you know how difficult that is to achieve? You think it's easy because you're like, well, I remember Michael, I remember Freddy. But seriously, what you don't realize is how many slasher figures you forget. So many of these films think it's just enough to fling on a mask and give a dude something sharp and that's it. Job done. But the really unique killers, the ones that stick out to us, they've got some great character designs. They can be simple. Simple's fine. Michael Myers is as simple a look as they come, but they have to have a unique quality to them. And Leslie Vernon just looks awesome. The costume design on this thing knocked it out of the park. From the first frame I saw him, his image was etched in my memory. And again, it's a pretty simple design, but all these little touches give it such a memorable iconography. The darkened eyes, the way the dungarees are dirty and torn up, the particular shade of blue on the mask that almost blends him into the fog, the raggedy hair, and my favourite element, that permanent wide frown. I can't quite explain what's so visually appealing about it. It's just doing it for me, man. It's just, it's got some good horror vibes. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that I love this movie. And I actually think it's a really layered piece of work with a lot more going on under the hood than just a few cute references and some tongue-in-cheek riffs on tropes. A lot of films often get described as a love letter to whatever. It's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot. A love letter to comics, a love letter to silent movies, a love letter to Universal monsters, what have you. But this film truly is deserving of that mantle because it is a love letter to slashers. Not just in the sense that it references them, but because it reveres them. It treats them with a level of appreciation, understanding, and careful dissection that love letter films rarely ever reach the heights of. In my mind, Leslie Vernon, by all accounts, should be a massive slasher icon. So please, watch this movie in huge numbers and make him one. So anyway, that's all from me, but before I go, let me just remind you, if you're a fan of horror and would like to dive deeper into the lost decade of 90s horror, then your humble little skeleton fella here can hook you up. In Search of Darkness, the award-winning Fangoria-nominated documentary series that dove into 80s horror for nearly 15 hours of gory goodness, has entered a new decade with its first 90s entry, which this guy is a credited advisor on. And as an advisor on the film, I've been given a cheeky little discount code that gets you 10% off of it. It's going to be amazing. The In Search Of series always knocks it out of the park, so if that seems like something you're interested in, then info and code is in the description below. And if you buy through this code, not only will you get a sweet ass doc on an underexplored period of horror, you'll also be supporting yours truly. Just for full clarity, this is not connected to this month's charity efforts, just making that clear. I became involved with In Search of 90s after I'd already planned Wholesome Halloween and the charity event for this year, and it just so happens that October is when their campaign is also running. So this is very cool, but again, totally separate thing. Patreon money, shirt sales, and ad revenue for this month though, as well as your lovely donations, will of course be going straight to supporting Trans Lifeline. Other than that, you know the drill. Like, comment, and subscribe to Matt Only Dance at the red button below. Hit the bell so you don't miss anything. And there's a bunch of links and stuff in the description for my Patreon, In Search of 90s, maybe Face of Horror voting if I'm still in. Make of all that lovely stuff what you will, and I will see you again tomorrow.